The house had 43 rooms. He walked through most of them that night, not looking for anything, not going anywhere in particular, just moving through the dark interior of Graceland, the way a man moves through a place when sitting still has become impossible, and sleep has become a country he cannot find the border of. It was late 1973. The divorce had been finalized in October. Priscilla Ann Presley had signed the papers, smiled at the cameras outside the courthouse in Santa Monica with the composed grace of a woman who had been preparing for this moment quietly, internally, for a long time. Elvis had stood beside her. They had embraced. The photographs show two people behaving with a dignity that surprised nearly everyone who knew what the marriage had actually cost both of them to maintain. Then the cars took them in separate directions, and Elvis Presley came home to Graceland. 43 rooms, a staff of 12, the Memphis Mafia, those loyal, devoted, sometimes suffocating men who had organized their entire lives around his, available at any hour. The gates, the grounds, the TCB lightning bolt on everything. The king's apparatus, in full and perfect working order. What was missing was so specific that it took up more space than anything that remained. To understand what the divorce took from Elvis, you first have to understand what the marriage had been. It had not been simple. He had met Priscilla in Germany in 1959, when she was the 14-year-old daughter of an Air Force captain, and he was the most famous man in the Western world temporarily wearing a uniform. He had brought her to Graceland, persuaded her parents with promises of propriety, and installed her in his house and his world, and the elaborate fiction that everything was appropriate and above reproach. He did not marry her until 1967, 8 years of Priscilla living inside Elvis's life, on his terms, in a world built entirely around his needs, his schedule, his very particular requirements. Colonel Tom Parker had wanted the wedding, the image of the settled king, the family man, the boy from Tupelo made wholesome, was useful in ways that Parker calculated with the cold precision of a man who had been calculating Elvis's image since 1955. The ceremony happened in Las Vegas, brief and private, managed down to the press release. Lisa Marie was born 9 months later, but Priscilla had been alone in that house for years, had grown from a teenage girl into a woman while Elvis was elsewhere, on tour in Las Vegas, behind the wall of men who ensured that nothing unexpected ever reached him. By the time she had grown fully into herself, the distance between them had widened past what either of them could honestly bridge. When she told Elvis she was leaving, not for Mike Stone, she said, but for herself, for the life Graceland could never contain. Elvis received the information in a way the men around him would spend years trying to accurately describe. He did not explode. He was very still for a very long time. And when he finally spoke, he said he understood, that she deserved better than what he had been able to give. Then he went upstairs, and the performance of understanding ended where the cameras couldn't follow. The men who lived in Elvis's orbit in the months after the divorce described the change in him with a consistency that, across decades of separate accounts, amounts to something like a portrait. He laughed the same amount. That surprised people who expected visible grief, public collapse, the operatic mourning of a man accustomed to performing his emotions at scale. The laugh was still there. The warmth was still there. The genuinely, constitutionally generous nature that had always been the truest thing about him. He still gave cars to strangers. He still sat with the staff at Graceland and talked for hours about God and the books he was reading. He was still, in all the visible ways, Elvis. But the laugh had a different bottom to it now. Red West, who had known Elvis since they were boys at Humes High School in Memphis, who had been his friend before anyone knew what he would become, noticed it first. It was not something he could explain in technical terms. It was something felt rather than observed. The laugh landed, and then, just beneath where the sound ended, There was a fraction of a second of something that didn't belong to the moment. He wasn't sad the way you expect someone to be sad, Red West would say later. He was sad the way a house is sad when someone leaves it. You couldn't point to the thing. The thing was just there, in the air. Priscilla's closet in the upstairs bedroom remained as it had been for weeks after the divorce. Nobody touched it because nobody was told to, and nobody was willing to be the one to ask. A staff member eventually, quietly, moved the remaining garments to storage. She did not tell Elvis she had done it. He did not ask. The photograph on his nightstand stayed where it was. He looked at it in the mornings. Whether this was habit or something more deliberate, no one could say. But the photograph stayed, and the staying said something that the words around it never did. The solution Elvis reached for was the one available to him, the one that had always worked with sufficient reliability that he had no reason to doubt it now. He filled the house. Graceland had always held many people, the Memphis Mafia and their families, visiting relatives, the permanent staff, the rotating cast of friends and associates that accumulated around a life as large as his. But in the months after Priscilla left, the population of Graceland increased in a way that the people inside it understood without discussion. Elvis did not want the house to be quiet. He watched movies through the night. Graceland had its own screening room, and Elvis had always been a man who stayed up late and found in films a manageable version of the human experience he could observe without being inside it. But now the screenings ran until 4 and 5 in the morning. The room full of whoever was willing to stay awake, the projector running film after film into the Memphis dark. He surrounded himself with women. This has been written about in ways ranging from salacious to sympathetic, but the truth of it is more ordinary and more sad than either register captures. Elvis Presley was a man who had organized his emotional life for 14 years around the presence of a specific woman in a specific house. When that structure was removed, he reached for what was immediately available. And what was immediately available in the life of Elvis Presley was abundant, but abundance is not the same as sustenance. He knew this. The men around him knew he knew this. Linda Thompson moved in. She had been with Elvis since mid-1972. A former Miss Memphis who was warm and devoted and patient in the particular way a person must be to love Elvis Presley and stay. She loved him. That was not in question. She took care of him with a thoroughness that went far beyond what any reasonable relationship could demand. Managing his medications, monitoring his sleep, staying awake through the night to make sure he was breathing. Elvis was grateful. He was also, in the way that people are when they are cared for by someone they cannot fully meet, unavailable, not cruel, not dismissive, simply not entirely there. The part of him that leaned in rather than away, that chose genuine contact over the comfortable distance celebrity had trained him to maintain. That part had been given somewhere else, and the address was no longer accessible. Linda Thompson stayed for 4 years. She was not naive. She understood, with the clear-eyed intelligence that people often conceal beneath gentleness, exactly what she was managing. She stayed anyway, because loving Elvis Presley was not a small thing, and the people who did it rarely found a clean exit from it. Lisa Marie was 5 years old when her parents divorced. She visited on the schedule that lawyers and courts and 2 people who had decided, with genuine mutual respect, to dismantle their life together. That schedule had established. She came on weekends. She came for holidays. She came with the unencumbered energy of a small child who had not yet learned to protect herself from the complexity of what her father's life had become. Elvis had given her a horse, a pony at first, then a proper horse as she grew. He had taught her to ride himself, out on the grounds of Graceland, the 2 of them moving slowly through the Tennessee morning, the enormous house visible through the trees, the rest of the apparatus temporarily suspended, while a man and his daughter did something ordinary and irreplaceable. Those mornings were the ones the people around him described differently from everything else. There was no performance in them. Elvis on a horse in the Graceland grounds with Lisa Marie was not the king. He was a father, specific, imperfect, overwhelmed, and genuinely without reservation in love with this particular child. He was fully present in those hours, in a way he rarely managed anywhere else after 1973. And when Priscilla's car came through the gates at the end of the weekend, when the visit ended and Lisa Marie went back to the world her mother was building in California, Elvis stood at the top of the driveway and watched the car go. He stood there longer than he needed to, not performing, not managing his face, just watching until the car was gone. He called Priscilla often in the years after the divorce, not to argue, not to relitigate what had ended. The calls were, by all accounts from people who witnessed them, something quieter and harder to categorize. He called the way a person calls someone who still holds the map of a territory they once shared. Priscilla had known the boy from Tupelo, inside the monument to the king. The divorce had ended the marriage. It had not, and could not, erase the history. Priscilla answered. She was careful with him. She understood, with the intuition of someone who had loved him since she was 14, exactly when he needed her to be steady. She told people who asked that she never stopped loving him, that the end of the marriage and the end of the love were not the same event. He kept her photograph on his nightstand until 1977, until there were no more nights. The tours continued. Vegas continued. The machine continued. Because the machine did not require Elvis to be emotionally present in order to run. And because everyone whose livelihood depended on Elvis Presley's operation needed the machine to run. And because Elvis himself, beneath all of it, needed the stage in a way that was almost biological. The crowd's response was the one external confirmation that he existed, that he mattered, that the enormous, improbable life he was living was not an elaborate error. But something had shifted in the relationship between Elvis and the stage after 1973. Before, the stage had been a place he went to give something. After the divorce, he went out there needing something different. He needed it to tell him he was still real, still connected to the world in some form that would survive the quiet of the house he drove back to when it was over. The crowd gave him that faithfully, but the drive home was long. And Graceland, even full of people, even loud with music and television and the voices of men who arranged their lives around his proximity, was quiet in the way that only one kind of absence creates, not the absence of sound, the absence of a specific person. The men who were paid to be with him noticed that his capacity for solitude had narrowed to almost nothing after 1973. He could not be alone. Not because he feared the dark in any simple sense, but because alone, in that house, what remained was too loud to sit with. We do not talk about this period with the care it deserves. We talk about the weight and the medication and the bad shows. We talk about it as decline, the long, sad epilogue to a story that really ended at the comeback special, or Las Vegas, or whichever moment we have decided was his peak. We have agreed, collectively, to read those final years as aftermath. But aftermath is lived from the inside. And from the inside, what Elvis Presley was living after 1973 was not the end of a story. It was a man in his late 30s, genuinely lost. Not catastrophically, not irretrievably, but lost in the ordinary human way of someone who has had the organizing principle of his private life removed and cannot find anything to replace it with. He had given the years that a man uses to learn who he is, in private, in failure, in the unremarkable daily negotiations of ordinary existence, entirely to a machine that had no use for that kind of growth. He had been famous since 21. He had been managed, packaged, insulated, adored, and maintained. He had been given everything except the freedom to become fully himself. In Priscilla, in her own imperfect and absolutely human way, had been the closest thing to a tether to that private self that he had ever allowed. When she left, the tether went with her. What remained was the stage and the gates of Graceland, and the yes-men who would not tell him the truth because the truth was too large and the cost of saying it too high. What remained was a man walking through 43 rooms at 3 in the morning, not looking for anything, not going anywhere, just moving, because movement was the only thing that made the particular quality of that silence bearable. He was 38 years old. He had 4 years left. He walked through the rooms, and the rooms held him, and the gates stayed closed, and Memphis went dark outside the walls, and he was alone in the way that only very famous people are alone, surrounded by everyone, witnessed by millions, and known completely by no one, not even himself.